My name is Bobby Farlice-Rubio, and I work here at the Fairbanks Museum in St. Johnsbury. I hope all of you have been to the museum where I work. If you haven't, you're missing out on one of the best historical treasures in the state of Vermont. However, the first website that you saw me pull up was from a different museum that's in Quebec, in a town called Saint-François-du-Lac, which the Abenaki people call Odanak. And because of the fact that there has long been a mission and a church that was central to the Abenaki culture, a lot of times in history you'll hear the Abenaki people called St. Francis Indians. That term is just one of many names used for the Abenaki people, but in a later time in American history that was used as a way to sort of disenfranchise them by saying that they didn't belong in Vermont because they were just St. Francis Indians. So that's part of the unfortunate name game. But let's get to something more ancient. Let me start with a story. Let me start with a story that'll give you an idea of a taste of the rich Abenaki traditional folklore. Now, do you recognize this view, anyone here? Ojihozo, yes. I'm so happy that somebody knows how to say his name. Ojihozo is the man who made himself. That's what that word means in the Abenaki language. What's that?
Made himself out of something.
Well, made himself out of something, the man who made himself. There's a story about him being created from the dust from Tabaldak, the creator's hands. As it fell to the ground, he summoned himself. One of my favorite stories about Ojihozo, and something that I use in a class on geology, because I use it to talk about how the Abenakis folklore indicated a great knowledge of how this land got to be the way it is. In the Abenaki folklore, when Ojihozo existed, people had not come into existence yet, like people like us. And he wanted to make this land better for people. So when he saw it, he saw a land filled with sharp mountains and little narrow streams, small lakes, and he thought, how are the people going to live here? Their houses are just going to fall off the cliffs of these steep mountains. And these little rivers are too shallow for anybody to travel through. And these lakes are too shallow for there to be fish. So he decided to take his newly formed body, made of gravel and sand and the dust of creation. And he dragged himself over the mountains. As he did, he got boulders that made his body larger, and he was able to slide across the mountains. And as he did, he noticed that his body would crush the mountains, smoothing them down and making them rounder. And then he would drag his body through the lakes and the rivers, noticing that they would become wider and deeper as he did so. So he realized he was improving the land. And after he was done with all of his hard work and all of his many other adventures, he retired to his favorite place. He decided to sit down in the water and just observe the beautiful land that he had finished sculpting after many other adventures. Let's not get into Grandmother Woodchuck and all that. But the whole point is that this story, to me, is a very elegant folktale that tells you exactly what happened here during the Ice Age. It describes everything that the glaciers did to our mountains, but in the personification of Ojihozo. And that rock right there, that's Ojihozo. Today, Abenaki people still bring him gifts, things like maple syrup, tobacco, and even hunting knives. This is something that happens on an annual basis. And if you were to ask a geologist what that rock is, you would say it's an erratic, it's a glacial erratic. It's something that was being carried by melting ice, and then when the glacier finally melted, it dropped that rock where it was. And that's exactly what the story tells us. Ojihozo retired. He got tired, he melted. So I think of the story of Ojihozo and this rock in the middle of Lake Champlain as a great way to understand how these stories can be true at the same time as they sound fantastical. They're describing something that really did happen here, and it also hints at the fact that the native people of this land have been here since the end of the Ice Age. In fact, archaeologists in Vermont have found stone tools going back 12,000 years. 12,000 years, just think of what that means. 12,000 years of continuity. The Abenaki language in that museum in Canada, they have a dictionary that has words for extinct animals like mastodon and mammoth. The fact that those words are still known in the language implies continuity to a degree that's probably unthinkable for a lot of people in today's societies, where everything is so fast and we all have ancestors that come from so many different parts of the world. Well, let me put up a map and let's do a little bit more of the name game. The word Abenaki actually comes from a word, and George, feel free to correct me, but it's more accurately pronounced Wabanaki. and that means the Dawn Land. And that's because the greater Abenaki Nation are the peoples of the east coast of North America. So it makes sense that they related to themselves as the people of the dawn, the people of the east, the people first to see the sunrise. Now, all of these different names that you see here are individual identities, like the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia. But if you ever go to Maine, for example, there in the school curriculum is called Wabanaki. They actually have the word a little closer to the original with the W at the beginning. So when you hear Wabanaki, that's the greater general cultural group. Individually, there were lots of different groups, like the Mi'kmaq, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Norwich-Walk, the Pigwacket, the Pennacook. And for around this area, the Missisquoi, the Kowasuk, the Sokoki peoples, those are the three greater groups that make up Vermont. And pretty much all of Vermont was Abenaki land, except for the southwestern corner near Bennington, which was part of the Mohican land. But pretty much all of Vermont was in this Abenaki family, you could say. And the peoples farther down south, like Wampanoag. Here's an interesting linguistic thing. Wampanoag, which everybody knows because of the history of the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving, Wampanoag is the same word as Wabanakik in that language. So Wampanoag, Wabanakik, you see there's a little bit of a difference, but they're similar enough that people from up here would have been able to visit with people down here and trade, and there was frequent intermarriage between different groups from different parts of what we now call New England. So all of the languages that were spoken around here were in a linguistic group called Algic or Algonquian. This is sometimes confusing when people see it in a history book, because there is a nation called Algonquins that live in Canada near Lake Ontario. And Algonquian, with an extra A, means people of a language that that group belongs to. That's like saying Indo-European, for example. If I say Indo-European, I mean all the languages, like that Latin languages, and Hindi, the language of India, is also Indo-European. That's a huge language group. And that's why in India they say mother for mothers, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of common links. So if you think about that large group, that's kind of what Algic means. It's a linguistic group where everybody had our same root language. And, you know, I grew up speaking Spanish, and that's why it was easy for me to learn French in high school, right? Because I grew up with the same grammar background. So when I was learning French, it was a lot easier than for the kids who didn't speak Spanish. It's the same thing if you were Abenaki going to Wampanoag lands. It would probably be like a Spaniard in France. You're like, oh yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. So that's what the things were like before Europeans arrived. Now, I want to put up another picture that comes from a National Geographic map. This is actually more of those linguistic groups. Do you notice that the linguistic group that involves the Abenaki folks stretches all the way down to Virginia? So this language group included the famous group of people that we associate with Pocahontas, the Powhatan people from Virginia. They would have spoken a similar language to the Abenaki people of up here. But there's a huge linguistic boundary right where Lake Champlain is. In fact, Lake Champlain's Abenaki name is Bitolbegok, which means the waters in between. So the name of the lake has always been border, basically, the border lake, the lake between us and them. And the them on the other side of the lake is what linguistic people would call the Iroquoian groups. And most prominently, the closest neighbor is the Mohawk Nation, which I believe in Abenaki is called Ganyankahaka. Well, please, George, I'm glad you're nodding. As long as you keep nodding, I feel good. So George knows a lot more of the language than I do. So this land over here was occupied by a group of people who had a very different linguistic group. And at the time when Europeans started arriving in this land, there was a lot of combat between the Mohawk peoples and the Abenaki people and their allies. In fact, that's kind of a huge moment in Vermont history. So I need to stop. I'll stop at any time if you have any questions. Well, while we have this map up here, the first European person that we have documentation of having visited this area is Giovanni da Verrazzano in the 1520s. And he didn't come to this side of Vermont, but he came to the New Hampshire and Maine coast. And before he came to this part of the coast, he had visited Narragansett Bay down here. And according to his own writings, Giovanni da Verrazzano's own journal, the Narragansett people were extremely welcoming. When they saw him, the chief moved out of his big house and let Giovanni da Verrazzano's officers move in. for the time that they were visiting. They showered them with gifts like the best furs, the best meat, and Giovanni de Verrazzano's crew did bring some trunks of trade goods like pots and pans and glass beads, the stuff that you've heard of in history. But something happened when they were leaving the Narragansett community. Mr. Verrazzano decided that he had to kidnap one of their boys, a 16-year-old boy. This is probably to show to his patrons back in Europe that he had really gone to the New World. Here's proof. I brought one of them Indians back with me. Well, because of that, obviously, the Narragansett people probably felt extremely betrayed. They're like, we treated this guy like family. He comes and kidnaps one of our kids. Well, the next place that Giovanni de Verrazzano goes is to the Maine, New Hampshire coast, and there he gets a very, very different reception. Instead of being welcomed, he sees a wall of canoes being built in the bay. Birch bark canoes up against each other, several deep, and only men out there. And they all were signaling to the guys in the ship like as if they knew that there were trade goods on board, but they wouldn't touch the sailors. They would only trade by throwing ropes on board and telling them to attach things to the ropes, and then they would pull them onto the canoes. So there was a strange sort of feeling of keeping a distance that wasn't there when they went to the Narragansett Bay. And then, this is the part that I love to tell, and maybe you remember if you were here last year, but this is in the written document. When Giovanni de Verrazzano decided to finish his business and leave, they were not going to get into the bay. They were not going to get in. So he decided to go. And when they did, all of the men in the canoes turned, showed their buttocks, and laughed. That's the quote. So he got mooned, like by who knows how many hundreds of people. You can't, I think that's welcome to, welcome to the Abenaki homeland. So, we have to speculate. We never really know for sure why one reception was so warm and the other was so chilly in another location, except that there's a good reason to believe that the word had gotten to the Abenaki people by then. The Narragansett people had ways of spreading messages according to what I've learned about this region, and this is the reason why wampum was considered so important. Wampum was never considered money. Wampum was considered something we need nowadays, unbreakable messages. A message that would take so many weeks and days to create that nobody could just rearrange the beads and change the message. But they were very general, like send all warriors, we're under attack, or stop sending warriors, we have reached peace with our enemies. So these wampum were belts that messengers could carry from one village to another. And if the messenger was exhausted, he could stop, pass the wampum to another runner, and the message would get there even if it was 5 or 6 people. It's kind of like the Pony Express, but with humans. And according to the oral tradition that I've heard, about 100 miles a day was the average distance they could cover with this messaging system. So if you imagine a ship at sea, the runners on land are going to beat them to the next location. So by the time Verrazzano got to where we live, the message was out probably that he was not to be trusted. And definitely not the first time that Europeans came to what we now call New England. Verrazzano was the first documented incidence of this. But there are lots of folk tales or oral tradition from, for example, Bristol, England, that fishermen had reached North America long before. And there's a story from Scotland in the Orkney Islands where somebody claims to have seen a kayak with an Inuit person paddling it. These are stories that kind of tell us that these contacts, that wasn't the first contact. It was just the first well-documented one. But who knows what happened in all these other times. There's an Abenaki story that I've heard about, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, but the Padnigoak is a name of a people that exist in the folktales of the Abenaki people. They have yellow hair, white skin, and according to the story, they're 7 brothers, and they had ships that had wings, and they used lightning and thunder as their weapons. That sounds like a fantastical folktale, but it also sounds like maybe an encounter with the Vikings or something like that. And they saw a sailboat in Lake Champlain, and they're like, whoa, who are those guys? And so a story like that's going to be remembered even if no formal contact was not made. So let me know if anybody has any questions. So, by the way, these things here, you probably already know this, but these are just some of the many crops that were native to North America that were unknown to the outside world until this time of contact. Peppers, tomatoes are not from Italy. Potatoes are not from Ireland. So sunflowers, corn, beans, squash, carrots. So all of these are foods that were unknown to Europeans until the time that we're talking about now. Well, another story to tell. Have you heard of Jacques Cartier, the French explorer? Okay. He didn't go this way, he went this way through the St. Lawrence. And according to his writings, and this was in the early 1500s, around the same time as Verrazano, but a different route, he went to where Quebec City is today, and I believe it was called Stadacona at the time. And then he also sailed to where Montreal is today, which was at that time called Hochelaga. And he met with a chief named Donnacona, who took him to the top of Montreal, Mount Royal, in the middle of the city, and pointed down towards the south and said, there's some people down there we don't like very much. He was pointing at Vermont, probably. At the time, these folks were linguistically connected to the Mohawk people. They were probably part of the greater, what we call in history, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. And there's based on what I've read, it seems like this group was like sort of an imperial march at that time, conquering the lands of their neighbors and expanding their territory, which meant that the Abenaki people were playing defense to this major confederacy, an old government that's around 1,000 years old today. Well, that's what happened when Cartier was there. He said that before he got to Stadacona and Hochelaga, he saw miles and miles and miles of planted cornfields along the St. Lawrence. He imagined that there must have been tens of thousands of people with all that food growing there. So that was Jacques Cartier. That was the 1500s. There's a little boy in France named Sam who grew up reading the works of Jacques Cartier. His name was Samuel de Champlain. He grew up a whole 2 generations later. And he said, I want to go see these things that Jacques Cartier wrote about. So he eventually grew up and got his wish. He got the boat. He got the expedition. He was able to make it to the St. Lawrence. And when he got there, he saw miles and miles of abandoned crop fields. Weeds and trees were growing in. He could tell that they had been cultivated fields, but it looked like it had been years since anybody had been there. And that right there is one of the most important facts of the whole history of this region at that time, was that between the time of Cartier's arrival and the time of Champlain, which is 1609 in Vermont, and think of the Pilgrims, around the same time at that time, between the 1500s and the 1600s, around 90% of the people of this land died from plague, from disease, from scarlet fever, from typhoid, from the flu, smallpox. All these diseases came with the European explorers, and you probably know this being in the Historical Society, but if you were alive in Europe at that time as an adult, you were lucky, because you probably saw most of your brothers and sisters die as children. And the people who were adults in Europe were people with ironclad immune systems, because of the fact that in Europe there was no sanitation in cities, so the people were literally dumping their chamber pots out the window on each other. Look out below, So there was a situation in which there were cities in Europe where disease was running rampant, and everybody who was an adult was either a survivor or a carrier of these diseases. And then those are the folks who came on the ships to explore America. So it's a really bad combination of timing. There's a quote from another book about European history that said that if Genghis Khan and the Black Death had arrived in Europe at the same time, then we would all be speaking Asian languages right now. I think that's true. But because Europe was already on its knees with the plague, but the conquerors came at different times, so luckily Europe was at full strength when the Mongols came. But what happened here, 90% reduction of the population meant that there was not enough people to put up a resistance to an invasion. And it's not there are people who think, it's a technological superiority thing. It really wasn't. There wasn't a huge amount of technological superiority. Guns back then were really slow to load. It took several minutes. It was an arquebus, this kind of a cannon thing with a tripod or a monopod, and it was really powerful, but really, really slow. In the amount of time it would take you to fire one of those musket balls, a warrior with a bow and arrow could have shot you, 30 times. You'd look like a porcupine. Yes?
The reason why Champlain, when he met the Iroquois at Ticonderoga, and he fired, there was 3 of them, 3 Frenchmen, and they fired, Champlain fired numerous balls from one shot. See, there's a lot of them in that one shot.
Yeah, like great shot.
Most people, they say he had an arquebus. Most people think he had a matchlock. He did not. He had a wheel lock, which is a lot more reliable because it spins on pyrite. That makes a shower of sparks. It's sure to go off. I had a chance to buy one years ago and I didn't. Now I regret it. And not only did it sure, he was not going to take, there was like 250 Iroquois against 60 Hurons and Algonquins, Abenakis on one side. So he wasn't going to rely on a slow-moving matchlock, which might not go off, kind of a slow match to make it go and all that crap. He's going to rely on state-of-the-art, which is a wheel lock. And he's going to fire more than one ball, which is why 3 chiefs fell when he fired. And then the 2 Frenchmen, they probably had wheel locks too, off on the side, also fired. And that panicked the Mohawks who did this broken ram, you know.
Well, and to put some context to what George is saying, from my understanding of the battle was being conducted in a formal way that the Abenaki folks, the Algonquins, and the Mohawks had sort of prearranged a site, and they would have a lot of ceremony that would go into it beforehand. Like the night before, there would be dancing on both sides. There would be the construction of these palisade walls, and the warriors would be wearing basically a weaponized version of baskets. If you can imagine the splints that make ash baskets and the materials that make birch bark wigwams and birch bark canoes. If you make armor out of this, you kind of look like a football player. I think of like the NFL players with all their pads and helmets. But this was good if you were fighting with spears and arrows. And according to what Champlain wrote, before they started fighting, there was a long time where they were just hurling insults at each other across, like, oh, your mother's a woodchuck or something like that, I don't know. And people were like teasing each other, and it seemed more like a big festival than like a war. And then eventually the spears and the arrows started flying over the wall, and then occasionally someone would get hit by one, and some people would get wounded. But usually the wounds were not fatal. Nobody really died that easily until the French pulled out their weapons that had never ever been fired in the history of this region, anywhere around for hundreds of miles. And then all of a sudden the balance had changed. So this is a painting showing, there's a lot of depictions of this that are inaccurate, but what I like about this one is that it's accurate in that they're riding in birch bark canoes. Champlain's ships got stuck at the waterfalls by Chambly, up north of Lake Champlain. So they left the ships there, and they got in the local vehicles, the original version of the Subaru right here, the birch bark canoe. So, and according to Champlain's own writing, it's kind of hard with this picture, but you can see a really big one back here. Some of these could hold up to 50 or maybe 100 people in them. So these were big war canoes, not like the regular we're going fishing kind of canoe. And they met at where Chimney Point and Crown Point are, and that's a part of Lake Champlain where you could throw a rock across it. So it makes sense that if you wanted to control that lake, you had to control this little bottleneck right there on the water. So that's where they had the battle, and as George says, when the guns went off and the Mohawks started seeing their chiefs and their warriors die, not just get wounded, but drop dead, they were like, we didn't sign up for this. We didn't expect to lose so many people. So they basically forfeited the war and left. And that was seemingly a victorious day for Champlain and the Abenakis and the Algonquins and the Hurons that were all allied together. But what I don't think anybody in this boat would have been able to predict, less than 50 miles away from that spot where that battle happened, Henry Hudson was sailing up the Hudson River at that same moment, on the same day. They were that close to each other. So the Mohawks that had just left the battlefield probably already knew, hey, I heard a rumor that there's a guy with these same big boom-making cannon things, whatever they call them. And what did they start calling them, George? Because I know that's your nickname, or your middle name.
Pisconic.
Pisconic?
That's from southern New England language. I'm from southern New England. But they call them a gun was a pashigun.
Pashigun.
Yeah, and see the pas is like, in English you say boom, bang, something like that.
Yeah, onomatopoeia, yeah.
Yeah, and the higan is the instrument, this explosion instrument.
So that's what the name meant, yeah.
Yeah.
Pashigun, yeah, the explosion tool or explosion instrument. Okay. Well, I remember Pishkunk, that was the name, because that sounds like the sound of a musket going off. So
tell people just remember pest and skunk and you got it.
Yeah. Well, so, but see what happened that day, which Champlain and Henry Hudson did not foresee, was that was probably the last day of traditional warfare in this region. The guns showed up, everybody was able to get their hands on them, and within a few years, that's how everything was conducted, with muskets and guns. And that meant that all the armor and all the pomp and circumstance and the pageantry of the old battles disappeared. Other people wrote about this, like Roger Williams of down in Rhode Island. He talked about that their wars were a lot less cruel than the ones that we had in Europe. I mean, Champlain himself was a survivor of the 100 Years' War. So you can imagine what they were used to in Europe compared to what people were used to here was a whole different thing. Like, anyway, so, I mean, not to get too far out of this area, you may know that the so-called pilgrims who called themselves separatists, they didn't call themselves pilgrims in Massachusetts, they decided to do a preemptive attack on the Pequot village. And even the Wampanoag people who were their allies at the time were like, we don't do that kind of thing. They went in and burned down the village, killed women and children. They're like, I know you guys were trying to help us, but that's not the way we do things around here. And that is one of the things that led eventually to what we now call King Philip's War, which was the big native reprisal against the British settlers that came in. But anyway, let's not get too far ahead of myself. Let me go to this picture. So, with Champlain, the French and the Abenaki people started forging a pretty long-lasting partnership. It was partly economic and partly religious because there's a lot of Jesuit missionaries that came with the French and they started converting the Abenaki people. And to this day, most Abenaki people I've ever met are Catholic from this heritage. However, this is a picture that was made by one of those Jesuit missionaries, and it's the oldest painting we have of an Abenaki couple. And they're a married couple with a baby on the cradle board in the back, if you can see that detail right there. And they're wearing a mix of traditional and more what you could say are the goods that were resulting from all the fur trade at that time. You see those cloaks that they're wearing are made out of the famous Hudson Bay blankets, made out of wool. Those were extremely valuable because of how useful they were. And people around here got into the habit of taking 2 or 3 or 4 of them and sewing them into all kinds of different garments made from the blankets. So that's why you see the multicolor cloak that she's wearing. And the hat that she and her husband are wearing are very traditional, made out of buckskin, deerskin with the fur still on the inside. And the decoration on both of their hats are made with porcupine quills. So this picture kind of has everything in one. All the modern stuff that they were going through, the traditional stuff, and this was what life was like in Vermont during the 1600s and 1700s. The fur trade basically changed how everybody had to live. Everything was oriented towards getting furs so that you could get these goods, and a lot of wars and skirmishes were fought over who could control which hunting lands. But in this picture, I just like the domestic tranquility implied by this picture here. Well, because this was not a peaceful time. But you see those, his legs, by the way, are bare. From what I understand, all winter and summer long, men would have their buttocks showing on the side. So the way that they dressed. So you just had to put a cloak over it if you wanted. The kids, when I teach them to this, they get a kick out of this. I start telling them, imagine dressing like this today if you could go to school dressed like that. And the ladies' dress is probably a dress gotten from trade, but the style and the cut of the dress is not very different from what would have been traditional at that time. And traditional meaning, well, was done here before European trade made other things possible. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because sometimes people use the idea of stone tools to imply that there's something primitive, like Stone Age, about this. But that's not at all what I get from looking at pictures like this. The amount of stone tools that they made were very sophisticated. I have some of the rejects from our museum's collection right here. Not the best ones that we have, and ones that we've been decontextualized. But just to give you an idea, you might have think of arrowheads and spearheads and knives, but did you ever think about drill bits? A drill bit. Well, everybody's heard of the bow drill that you use to start a fire, but that same tool could be used to drill very precise little holes in wood using a stone bit. So it just gives you an idea of the amount of meticulous detail it would take to make something this small out of stone. And these are all from real findings around New England archaeologists have found, including discs and spheres made out of stone. I wouldn't kick it, but you can imagine a lot of games that could be played with that. Look at this hammer stone right here with the obvious place where you would have to handle onto it. All the wood and the leather rots away, so sometimes archaeologists have to kind of guess as to how they were used, but not here. That's an obvious kettle made out of soapstone. And I've heard that Hazen's Notch is an area where people used to quarry soapstone around here. So maybe if anybody local could tell you something about that. And occasionally, rarely, you would find pieces of almost pure copper. And all the copper that was in this region is thought to have been imported from the Lake Superior region. So just think about the fact that that meant that people had to have trade networks that could extend that far. And in Vermont, shells from Florida have been found. Things that were brought from Alaska have been found. So that doesn't mean the people from those places came, but at least the goods made their way from hand to hand from thousands of miles away to this land. But there's not a lot of iron, there's not a lot of metal that you could smelt around here. So that kind of technology never took place. But what's cool is in the convergence of technology, look at the shape of these axes. I mean, they're exactly like, and that chisel, they're exactly like what you would make out of iron and steel today. So the function was all the same, but the tools were harder to make, harder to come by. And I have some projectile points and other types of tools and knife blades and things like that. Everybody always thinks they're arrowheads, but this is too big to be an arrowhead. This is a knife. It's actually pretty sharp, even though it was buried for thousands of years. And I wish I could tell you where all of these were found, but this comes from the time when at the Fairbanks Museum, kids would bring in something that they found in the field and somebody would just chuck it in a box. So it got totally archaeologically decontextualized. So they're cool, we know they're real, but we can't tell you anything more about them, unfortunately. But things have changed now, we wouldn't do that anymore. But let me move on. Because this is, to me, one of the most amazing innovations of Abenaki technology, the birch bark canoe. Now, you see the picture on the top left, why they were so handy. With all of our waterfalls, you'd have to constantly pull your boat in and out of the water. So having a heavy dugout canoe, which were used, but they were not the ones that you would take on a long trip. So birch bark is just the outside, and I have some pieces of birch bark if you want to know what that's like. This is not the peely stuff that comes off of the trees with no effort. You have to go in the spring or in the winter and make very careful incisions on the tree, and you can pull off an enormous amount of bark, and if you do it right, the tree doesn't die. It'll grow back with a wrinkly bark that won't be useful the next time, but you could do this to a tree, get an entire tree's worth of bark, and the tree can still grow. And then you make a frame out of cedar, and you use that little drill bit that I was showing you to make these little holes so you have mortise and tenon joinery. And then the thing that you would use to sew it all together would be black spruce roots. And I actually have a little basket here that was made by Abenaki craftspeople up in Odanak recently. This isn't a boat, but it has more or less the same materials. It's got the birch bark and it's got the black spruce root right around here. The only thing that's missing is the waterproofing that you would use on these holes, and that would be a combination of animal fat and black spruce pitch and charcoal. It would look like black silly putty. And it would be very hard, like resin, but if you heated it up with your hands, it would turn soft. So you could warm it up and get it to be, pliable and stick it into the little holes, and then it would cool and harden. Yes, George, you have one of these? Yeah. Well, this gives you the idea that birch bark is not the flimsy stuff that you might think it is. It's actually, oh, that's great. We have two at the museum that are over 100 years old. We just restored one of them, so one of them could still be used. And that is true for these. These would be multi-generational boats. They weren't disposable. Even though they were highly biodegradable, people had tricks for keeping them preserved. And one of them is to put them under water completely during the winter when you couldn't use it.
Where's Fairbanks?
Yeah.
Your birch, do they keep it in the museum?
Yeah, we have a collections building, so it's not on display. But if you ever came to visit the museum and you asked for me, I would take you to it so I could show it to you in our collection storage.
If you said one of them can be used today?
Well, we're getting it restored by somebody who's a professional birch bark builder. So they're restoring it with the original materials. And we're not going to go take it out on the river, but it's going to be restored to that condition.
Well, wherever you keep it, you better keep it out of doors, because you're going to let the air get at it. Because if you put it indoors, there's a natural sap in the bark that will dry out, and the root stitching, that will break because it'll expand. This is what happened at the Lake Champlain Museum. They had a canoe made by Aaron York, but they had it indoors. And then this outfit, Lake Monsters, want to do a film there about Champy. and they, well, you can't use this canoe. There's the only canoe we got. And so, because it broke, if they put it in the water, it would sink immediately.
Yeah.
It would float as long as nobody's in it, but you put somebody in it. And they had two Abenaki members who were supposed to be in it, paddle out, so they couldn't use it. So they had to come to me
Use your boat.
and rent one of my canoes. And that's in the film today, my canoe.
Oh, I gotta see that. But we'll see what you're saying. I agree that these boats were meant to be stored in moist conditions. But I work at a museum, and it's good luck convincing my director of collections to do that. Yeah, we're gonna take this boat outside. He's like, I was like, but George said no. He won't. So.
Put it outside where people can't get at it.
Well, I agree. I mean, the way that they were originally designed, they would be never inside, of course, and they were meant to be soaked underwater. Like I was saying, they would put them in a pond, a place with no current, and then bury it with stones so it wouldn't float away. And then if it's under the ice all winter long, it can't rot while it's totally soaked. But if you left it, like, I don't know, sitting on some sawhorses, dripping in the rain, then it would start to decompose. So you either had to use it or stick it in the water completely. But I just brought these pictures up. These are from Old Town area of Maine, the Penobscot region. And these are people using birch bark canoes until modern times. And that, by the way, is Old Town on Indian Island in Penobscot, but the Penobscot River. But you know what Old Town is famous for now? Making plastic canoes. So I always think it's really funny, to see this picture. However, this is the other great technology made with birch bark, the wigwam. Now, when people see pictures like this, everybody wants to say the word teepee, but that's from a totally different language, from 1,000 miles west of here. These were camping tents, and that's what you might build if you were going to go fishing for a couple of days or weeks on this river and then leave. But your permanent wigwam would be a substantial structure. And I met with a professor from University of Maine who's actually from the Penobscot Nation. His name is John Bear Mitchell, and he received a grant to take a bunch of Penobscot teenagers to go into the woods and build about 16 different wigwams based on the traditional designs. So it was basically a gallery of all the different designs that they knew about from the oral tradition. Some of them were like this on the surface, and the ones that were meant to be used in the winter were buried about 4 feet down. And I'll explain a little bit, because you wouldn't necessarily live in the same place in the winter that you would in the summer, but that doesn't mean that the Abenaki people were nomadic people. They generally stayed in the same area where they were born, but, well, here's the way I put it. How many people know somebody with a hunting camp here in Vermont? That's pretty much the way Abenaki folks lived for all year round. They had a different house for different purposes in different parts of the countryside, depending on what you needed to do. So your summer house would be on the ground, and it would probably be by the river near the places where you grew your food, which would be the floodplains, the oxbows, and all the wonderful, fertile land that we have on the river valleys around here. That's where people hung out during the summertime. But in the wintertime, when more of your food came from hunting, it wouldn't make sense to have everybody living in a crowded village. So think of each village as sort of spreading out into a large constellation of hunting camps that surrounded it for miles and miles in the hills and mountains around. So every village would kind of contract in the summer to living all close together, and in the winter spread out. Sometimes in the middle of the winter, during the solstice, they would come back and have ceremonies. Nothing else to do in the winter anyway, just kidding. So, and then they would go back to their hunting camps. But this kind of back and forth from the winter home to the summer home was kind of the rhythm of life for the Abenaki families. So they had different kinds of houses. And like I was saying before, the winter ones, the hunting camp ones, were usually buried about 4 feet down, so you get some of that geothermal heating, keeping your house warm. And almost always they had fires on inside. So you might think, oh, birch bark house in the winter, what? Oh, gosh. But what we have for documentary evidence comes from people like those pilgrims who, when they arrived on Cape Cod, some of them stayed in elm bark wigwams made by the Wampanoag people, similar construction but a different tree for their bark. And according to one of those English people, they said these houses are warmer and drier than the houses we left back in England. So that tells you something. I mean, think of the thatched roof, stone-walled English country house on a rainstorm. Think of all the leaking, roof, and then you have this little tight thing that's built like a boat, upside down, tight, and with a fire within, 3 or 4 feet of you at all times. I could see them being comfortable.
Another thing about them, they were often insulated. Be two canoe wigwams with dead leaves in between as insulation for the winter.
Yeah, that's it. Hey, I live in a straw bale house, so it's not that different, really. Nothing that significantly different there. So, yes, it works. And people were comfortable. People did it in style. In fact, this goes on to another part I want to tell you about, because Vermont today, rightfully so, gets a reputation for being a very peaceful place. But this was not the case during these times when the French folks were coming in, and then you had 100,000 British people every year getting off on boats in southern New England. It was sort of like, you know, two opposing forces were going to collide. The amount of land needed by all these English folks, and the fact that these folks were losing their population from disease and were not able to successfully keep people from taking their land, eventually led to the war that we call King Philip's War. Now, King Philip was not called King Philip in his own language. He was called Metacom, but he was the grandson of Massasoit. And Massasoit was the man who made the treaty with the Pilgrims and got that peaceful relation going that we think of at Thanksgiving. But 2 generations later, it was all done. And it was time for open conflict. And it turns out that Vermont was sort of like the refuge for the people from southern New England that were being displaced by the British settlements. As they were getting into Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island, the people who lived there said, let's go up to Vermont, because at least our folks are up there still, and there's no English folks up there. In fact, at that time, the Abenaki called people from the English settlements Bostoniac. Can you see why? Boston, Bostoniac. And they called the French people Blackmonac. And I don't know exactly where that comes from. I always think of the black Jesuit folks, but they didn't speak English, they spoke. Where does that come from? Tell me.
It comes from French with Abenaki, plural. The blanc is from white. The mon is from man. The rest is Abenaki.
Blanc homme.
The animate plural on them, like moni ak.
Yeah, the ak means place, like.
No, that's another. That's OK or ek. Ak is the people.
Okay.
Or animals. It can be animals too. Birds,
Okay.
like that. You know.
All right. So there you have it. You have the north in Quebec, the French, which had low populations of Europeans. I mean, the French colonies were never growing as fast as the British ones. And the Abenaki had been allied with them. And then the British ones were growing really fast and spreading northward. And so you started having conflict. And there's a lot of different stories of British settlers being kidnapped or having their villages raided by native people. In fact, the Deerfield raid is one of the most famous ones in history, where the village of Deerfield, Massachusetts, back when it was, you know, maybe a dozen houses and a few families from England, they got raided by a big coalition of different people, including Mohawks and Abenakis working together, which was just to show you how things had shifted and changed, politically speaking, around here. And they went into that village. They rounded up a lot of people. People who resisted were killed, but a lot of people were kidnapped safely. And the native people went to Deerfield with a bunch of snowshoes. They had backs covered with snowshoes, so all of their captives got snowshoes. So when the British militia went to go get them, they couldn't keep up, because even the kidnapped people were going faster than their rescuers. So so in this raid, there was a particular young lady named Eunice Williams. She was only 7 years old. Her father had been the reverend of the village and had been killed because he put up a resistance, and his daughter was kidnapped. Right? And so the Williams family hired every scout they could to go out into Vermont and to find poor little Eunice. They did not find her until she was in her 20s. And by the time they found Eunice Williams, she had forgotten how to speak English. She had married a Mohawk man and had, gone native, as people might say. So, and she didn't even remember that she had been from a British, settlement. So these are really weird times. And as for every story of somebody getting killed in one of these raids, there's also a story about somebody being rescued and treated very well, like the story of the Abenaki raid that kidnapped a pregnant woman, and when they realized she was pregnant, they stopped traveling and they set up camp and waited for her to have her baby, and then they kept traveling. So those are stories that you don't usually get in the history books, but I'm not going to make it seem like it was all happy. It wasn't all bad either. It was kind of a mix of both. Constant chaos, though. Disruption, upheaval. All right, so I want to connect it to something very, very specific to this region that you folks would probably get a kick out of. Okay, I guess I'm going to jump a little forward in the future, going to the time that we call the French and Indian War. This was sort of like the end of all of the long century of conflict. What didn't end well for the Abenaki people. But if you guys remember in your history book, Old France and Old England got into a big fight. So that meant New France and New England were also in a big fight. They called it the 7 Years' War over there. We called it the French and Indian War over here. And at the end, the French side with the Abenaki allies were conquered by the British. If you go to Quebec, I heard that they still call that war the War of the Conquest. And that is what they talk about when on the Quebec license plates it says Je me souviens, I remember. That's what they're remembering. 1762, being conquered by the British. So you might remember more than me the terrorists in the 70s that wanted Quebecois independence and blew up places in Ottawa and things like that, right? Well, all of that stems from this history, going back to the French and Indian War. So the British won. They conquered Quebec, and the Abenaki, for the first time in their history, were not in control of this land because they had independence under the French, but under the British, they were now subjects of the British Crown. Not everybody was excited about that around here. So during the French and Indian War, there was a guy named Moses Hazen who, at that time, was not yet a colonel. I think he was just a captain, and he was in charge of raiding a village on Nova Scotia as part of the effort. And he had the village raided. They burned down many wigwams. Many people were killed, and many orphans were created. One of these guys that was an orphan, his name was Zosep. And he became an orphan at that time, and he lived on his own. And according to the story, he wandered into New England, going away from where the British were, and ended up finding himself in Vermont. Do you know who I'm talking about? Zosep? Yeah, Indian Joe. So Indian Joe was made an orphan by a raid that Moses Hazen was a part of. And how weird is it that a generation later, they were working together building the Bailey Hazen Road. I don't know if Zosep would have known that this particular British man was responsible for having had his village burned down. But the coincidences are crazy, but that just gives you an idea of what it was like in those times. So Zosep became an orphan, wandered all around, learned about everything, and ended up in Vermont, ended up in Newberry, which is where Jacob Bailey and Moses Hazen ended up building a settlement after the French and Indian War. So if you go up and down the Connecticut River Valley, when you go to Massachusetts, you'll see that the towns in Massachusetts, like Hadley, they were founded in the 1600s by British people. But nobody British could found a town in Vermont until 1762. And that's why you see all these towns have very similar starting dates up and down the Connecticut River Valley. Because basically that meant, oh, we beat the French, the Abenakis are on their heels, now we can take this land. And that happened very, suddenly. Well, but before that happened, starting in the 1720s, there was a man who was supposedly from the Swanton area, Missisquoi area. His name in Abenaki, I believe, is Wawanolewat. But the British people started calling him Greylock because of the fact that he had a white stripe of hair on his head, even though he was a young man. So he had this distinctive hair that made him stand out, and he got a reputation for being like the boogeyman of Western Massachusetts. From 1720 to 1724, from what I remember, he raided those villages and would burn things down with only a small group of you would call it guerrilla warfare today. He would take like 12 guys, they'd sneak in to a little town like Leverett, Massachusetts, light everything on fire, run into the bushes, and everybody would be like, ah, the village is on fire! And then this is actually where Minutemen come from. The Minutemen were not originally to fight against the British, because they were British for most of that time. But the Minutemen were village militias that were meant to prepare for Indian raids. So that's why they had to be ready in a minute. These guys are coming to burn down a village. Everybody get ready. And they would muster and they would be ready with their muskets standing in formation in the village square. Where's the guys that did this? We don't know. Which way did they go? I think they went that way. So they would go off looking for them over here. Meanwhile, Greylocks and his men would be sitting like on a bluff watching this happen, laughing. Oh, they're never going to find us. And these guys would go out for weeks looking for Greylocks and his men. They would come back to their villages hungry, running out of provisions, and then they would get attacked on the road like a mile from their houses. And Greylocks was using this to kind of psychologically abuse the British and get them out of there. And he became a hero amongst the native people and a menace to the British settlers. I think it's really funny that Massachusetts' tallest mountain is named after him. Because that wouldn't have been, I mean, the people of Massachusetts in the 1700s wouldn't have appreciated that. Yes.
I come from Westfield, Massachusetts.
Ah.
That was where Greylock came from.
So he was displaced from there and then came back.
He went all the way up to what is now Swanton, Vermont, and the village up there was fortified, so the English people call it Greylock's Castle. Any Indian village is fortified, they call it castle.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of following his footsteps. You know, I decided, well, I want to be in Vermont. I don't want to be in Massachusetts. Get too crowded now. The mountains up there are higher than more bears in the woods. I want to be there. So I've been following Greylock. And his name means in Abenaki means I spell it.
Cannot be
I
followed.
want to hold at the end because it's formal name because it means he who fools them or he who throws them off the track.
Yeah.
But if that could be anybody who does that. But if your formal name, you could put like an O at the end. O and not O is really hard to pronounce. And they Warnoco, the English called his town Warnoco, but I think it was called Owanoco.
Whoa, I do know.
You know about non-labial fractal?
Oh, well, I'm not going to go into the linguistics right now, George, with everybody. I want to kind of keep the flow going, right? So, but just to finalize this story, he did these raids. He was unstoppable. But on his last name, right now, if you go to Quebec in the area around Odanak and you get a phone book, there's a whole section of people with a last name Wanolet that comes directly from him. They're his descendants. So there's a section that you can read. These folks are Greylock's, great-great-grandchildren or so. But, just to finish this part of the story, the British decided that they needed to do something about these raids, so they built a series of forts along the Connecticut River, thinking that this would be the perfect solution. And they named the forts in the number in which they built them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And number 4 is still standing as a museum, so if you ever go to Fort number 4 in Charlestown, New Hampshire, that was actually an anti-Greylock security measure. And it didn't work. I mean, can you imagine folks with the ability to go from boat to a tree to land, and you build a fort, a fixed building, and hope that that's going to stop them? It didn't work. But for whatever reason, Greylock stopped doing his raids, and the only reason why we know what happened to him at the end of his life is that he got baptized in his 90s. He converted to Catholicism, and he brought all of his children and grandchildren to the church to get converted too. So since the priest wrote it down in the logbook, and this is a church that no longer stands, I believe it's a church that was in Highgate Springs, Vermont, was built in 1800 or 1700, but it's the first Christian church ever built in Vermont, and it's no longer standing there. But according to the story, it was built with the Jesuits' supervision and the Abenaki labor, and they brought the stone blocks to build this on canoes. They floated them down the Missisquoi River 1 block at a time. They built the church, and then when the church was destroyed, probably anti-French sentiment, the church was disassembled, and people's probably houses around Highgate and Swanton are built with it in their foundations. I don't know what ended up happening to it. So there was a lot of anti-French sentiment at the end of the French and Indian War, and that also became anti-Abenaki sentiment too. And that goes into modern times, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But we're jumping all over the timeline here, going from Greylocks in the 1720s to the 1760s, the French and Indian War. So, long stories short, you have in the late 1700s people like Joe Zosep, an orphan from the French and Indian War, and people like Jacob Bailey and Moses Hazen, people who are British soldiers but starting to feel that they don't really like their imperial government anymore. And you know what I'm getting to, the American Revolution, of course. Only a couple decades, not even a couple decades, a decade and a half after the French and Indian War, all of a sudden this land is blowing up with another war. This time it's American versus British. And in this case, the Abenaki folks generally took the side of the Americans because they had no love for the British through all these centuries. And Zosep actually got a commission. Joe became a captain in the Continental Army. So I would try to tell the school at Danville, they're called the Indians as their nickname, their school mascot. I was like, why don't you guys go by the captains or Captain Joe's? At least honor his rank and the fact that he was a veteran instead of, But anyway, so Captain Joe and a lot of other Abenaki folks were part of the American Revolution. And there's one particular person that I think is an interesting character. If only to tell you how complicated the concept of heritage and bloodlines are. And I don't want to go into politics, but you probably remember what happened, unfortunately, when Elizabeth Warren published the fact that she had an ancestor that was Cherokee, and then the Cherokee Nation was like, that's not cool because our citizenship is not based on blood, it's based on belonging, like registry, kind of like our countries, you know. It shouldn't be any different. So, well, there's a man named Joseph St. Louis Gill that in the history books is called the White Chief of the Abenaki. And that's because both of his parents were British children that had been kidnapped in some of these raids. But they were both raised in an Abenaki village. So both of his parents were culturally Abenaki, but genetically British. And to the Abenaki, that didn't matter if their genetics, what mattered was their culture. So their son, Joseph St. Louis Gill, was born blonde hair and blue-eyed. And when the American Revolution broke out, he was an adult at this point, and he was considered influential. Of course, the British and the French were like, we should talk to that guy. We have an in with him because he's white. You know, maybe he'll talk to us. You know, and so they ended up, what happened is that he became a double agent. He got an officer commission from the British and one from the Americans. And I need somebody who's a little bit better with the American Revolutionary history, because there was an American general that he was tasked with capturing. And he captured the general, and he got him really close to the British lines in Canada, and then suddenly that general escaped. I don't know how he got away, boss. So
That's Whitcomb.
yeah, General Wickham, yes. Yes, so they think that Joseph St. Louis Gill pretended to capture him and then let him go because he was really working for the Americans, pretending he was working for the British. So just tell me that wouldn't be a fun movie to make, you know, about the regional history here and like, are you white, are you Abenaki? He could just change clothes, you know, and walk into the tavern and kidnap the general. And so that just gives you an idea of how the times, the boundaries and the definitions and personal cultural identity, everything was being thrown into a big blender at that time. That's America, but this is the beginnings of what we now consider normal in America. So now, okay, so, well, to get back to more modern times, when Joe left the army, the American Revolution was over, it meant great times for all the Native people, right? No, it didn't. In fact, the country that they helped to create immediately turned its back on a lot of those same people who have helped do this. In fact, there's a letter in the Barnett Historical Society that a local Barnett veteran of the Revolutionary War wrote to President Washington saying, it's not fair that Joe hasn't gotten his pension like all of us other soldiers have. So he basically was begging President Washington to give Joe the pension that he deserved because he wasn't getting it. And at that time, Joe was becoming an older man. He had alcohol problems. Some stories say that he might have been losing his mind. I mean, if you think of all the things he went through, you can't blame the guy. And in later life, he was living on that island in Joe's Pond in West Danville, not too far from here. There's an island where there's a little camp, and that was his sort of retirement home. And the Molly's Falls Pond is named after one of his wives, Molly, who may or may not have been murdered. There's a lot of weird speculation about what happened to her. But whatever happened, Joe was so well liked by the people of Newberry that when they found out he was getting old and not able to take care of himself, the reverend in the church at Newberry had Joe move in with him. And so that's where Joe ended up spending the last days of his life, was in Newberry, Vermont. And there is a cenotaph that had his name on it in the Newberry Cemetery, but that doesn't actually have his body in there. It's just a marker that says the good Indian, old, Indian Joe. And it was put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but that's not actually where he's buried. He's buried on a farm a few miles away from that spot. So that's an interesting character because he went from the French and Indian War until the early 1800s of America. And by the time he died, this young woman was being born. Her name became Sarah Summers. This is a woman who grew up in Lancaster, Lunenburg, Vermont. And this book was written by one of her descendants, Trudy Ann Parker. This book is a sort of a historical fiction in the sense that she took the details of her life and put together a narrative, but it's not everything that happened in this book is exactly, an actual event because she didn't have enough of her aunt's life to construct. But one thing that's interesting is that her father's name was Taxos. And when he would go into town in Lancaster to trade, everybody didn't understand his name was Taxos, so they called him Jackson. So when Sarah was born, they called her Sarah Jackson. So this is like a name that was just created out of thin air. Sarah Jackson, So Sarah, I don't know what her real name was, if that was her name, was known as Sarah Jackson. Then she later married a man with the last name Summers, and that's why she got the name Summers. But she was a midwife, she was an entrepreneur, she was a basket maker. In fact, she used to make baskets the same way that my friend Jesse LaRock makes baskets out of ash wood. That's a friend of mine who grew up in St. Johnsbury, Jesse LaRock, and I wish he could be here to tell his story, but he was a veteran of the Special Forces in Beirut during the 1980s, if you remember how bad those days were. And he came back with, problems that he figured he could solve for himself by getting in touch with his own ancestry and culture. And so he learned how to be a basket maker, and he also produces a lot of the black ash basket material that other people use. So a lot of the baskets that you might buy around here could be made from his material. He does it the old-fashioned way, by pounding a log and then splitting off the annual growth rings. That's what this is. And then that, without anything more than a small tool like a metal blade, it can be turned into this. No polishing, no sanding. It's just beautiful, iridescent looking material. And that's how we can make all those different baskets. Well, Sarah Summers used to do that for a business, and we actually have one of her more than 100-year-old baskets at the Fairbanks Museum on display. But she was an entrepreneur. She wasn't just doing this to be traditional. Inside each basket was a sewing kit or different accessories and accoutrements that the farm wives would want. So she was, marketing herself, and she knew what she was doing. She was also a midwife, and one of the things that people said about her, and I have a sample of it here, was that she also used to use sweetgrass to make her baskets. And this is a sacred plant in the Abenaki traditions. And according to people, her hands always smelled like this. It's one of the nice things I think about because I can smell this. This stuff has been braided for about 10 years and it still smells really good. And this is another interesting story, Hyerchlori odorata. This species, it's found all around the areas of the temperate forests and north, like into the Arctic Circle, but it cannot grow by seed. This is a plant that can only grow by cuttings, by cloning. So you have to take a clump of little leaves and mud with roots and transplant it to get it to grow. Otherwise, you'll never get it to grow. So the fact that this is everywhere kind of shows the progress of native peoples through this land. They brought this with them, and they had to have intentionally planted it because you would have to have taken we're moving, so let's take this clump of sweetgrass, and when we get to the new spot, we're going to camp, we're going to plant it here. And so according to people like Sarah, this is like a treasured knowledge. If you know where this stuff grows, you don't tell anybody. And it grows in marshy places. And every now and then when they're haying at this time of year, I go by a hayfield and I smell it. And I go, I wonder if a corner of that hayfield or maybe the little ditch by the edge of the road is a patch of sweetgrass that is just now part of the hay bales. Because I swear that I smell it. If you smell this, you might recognize it. But anyway, it smells like cinnamon and vanilla mixed together. It's really good. But, here's a funny picture. I don't think you can read it, but it says, a sachem of the Abenaki Nation rescuing an English officer from the Indians. It's like, chill it, guys. Don't kill him quite yet. So, not yet. Let's see if we can get some ransom from him first. So, but I just show that picture because look at the landscape. Doesn't it look like outside right now? It looks like it should be the peaceful Vermont that we all know. But it was anything but peaceful for a long period of time. So, going on to a person like Sarah Summers. Her life. Well, as old Joe was dying, she was born. What was her life like back in those days? Well, she got called all kinds of names and discriminated against. They used to call her things like river rat and gypsy. And the whole gypsy thing, of course, it's not only just culturally inaccurate, it also tells you something about what life was like for these folks at that time. They were not really allowed to rent or buy houses in a town. So if you were in an Abenaki family, you probably camped out in a river or somewhere near the village where you could go in and trade and get work, but you probably were never going to be treated like a normal citizen. So they lived on the edges and the fringes of society. And I've heard of people, whenever I go around the state talking about this, I hear from people who grew up in Vermont a long time ago saying things like, oh, I remember that. My grandparents told me don't go over there because that's a gypsy camp over there. And we just thought that they meant like actual gypsies, like, fortune tellers and all that. But they were talking about Abenaki people. So at that time, being marginalized members of American society, always being mistreated, always being treated as if they were foreigners or not belonging where their ancestors had always been. That was a tough time for her. But By the time Sarah was becoming an old woman, when she was, she lived to be 107 years old, by the way. So, and that's something, I read a story about Passaconaway from the Pennacook Abenaki. He lived over 100 years old. There's several examples of people in traditional times living more than 100 years. So good diet, I guess. That's what I'm going to guess. But in her time, right when she was dying, this movement started taking place in the world. This pseudoscientific movement called eugenics. Today, unfortunately, we're all well too familiar with it, but it was being hidden as a form of science, of let's improve the human population by weeding out the undesirable peoples from the gene pool. And this idea was very popular in Vermont. I mean, that's why they're no longer calling it the Dorothy Canfield Fisher Prize, because she was an advocate for that. She wrote in support of this in her non-children's books. So, so now this is what's called Dorothy's List because of that. And I think there was a name of a building in UVM that they changed the name of because the person who was named after was another person who proposed that we do this here in Vermont. So under the disguise of public health, with people wearing lab coats and driving around in ambulances, they said they were doing public health surveys to find out what diseases were out. And that seems like a good thing. But what they were doing to people who were of undesirable categories is that they were taking them to the hospital saying, oh, we need to take you into this clinic for another little checkup. They would put them to sleep, knock them out, and then sterilize them. So tubes tied or vasectomies. And this started, there wasn't just Abenaki people that were targeted. In fact, in the eugenics documents, they never mention Abenaki by that name, but they mentioned river rats and gypsies as being some of their targets. And they also mentioned Irish and French, and basically anybody who was Catholic at that time. So you could kind of see what was really going on here. And of course, eugenics started in Vermont in the 1920s. It also took place in Germany around that time, and obviously the people who took eugenics seriously in Germany got very far with it, and we call them the Nazis today. And that was the exact same motivation behind the Nazis and their death camps and the final solution of exterminating Jewish people, because remember, they also went after the real gypsies, the Roma people. So in a way, these movements were all tied together. Luckily, in the United States, it fell to the wayside and never got taken as seriously, but that was going on up until the 1950s in this country. And in other states too, black people in North Carolina, just recently a group of black women got settlements now for having been sterilized back in the 40s from those kinds of times.
I got a pamphlet. You can read like Don Stevens is in the Mohegan band. Mm-hmm. It's the Perkins solution.
Yeah.
About this.
Yeah. That's the name of the guy with the building of UVM.
Is printed a swastika.
Yeah.
That was in the 20s. That didn't have anything to do with the Nazis. In the 20s, the swastika was regarded as a positive symbol. So a lot of people had that.
Yeah, there was a Wisconsin women's baseball team called the Swastikas.
It was like prophetic, because then the Nazis had adopted it, and today it's a symbol of evil.
Yeah, it was a prophetic by accident. Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, anyway, those ideas made it so that if you were in an Abenaki family, you didn't want to tell anybody about this. In fact, there's an Abenaki author named Joseph Bruchac who wrote a book. It's a young adult novel to explain this idea to young kids, but it's good for anyone. It's called Hidden Roots. It's about a little boy who finds out that his family is actually native, but he never knew because they had constructed this completely alternate reality version of their family history so that their kids wouldn't be vulnerable. So yeah, you're just telling them you're Italian or something like that. That'll explain a lot, and then they'll leave you alone. But so for a long time, people who were Abenaki either hid it or their kids never found out. And that's kind of what happened into the modern times. So I remember moving to Vermont in the late 1990s, and I remember meeting a guy saying, I didn't know there were native people around here. I thought it was too cold. And I came from Florida. I moved to Vermont. I'm like, I'm pretty sure the cold never scared off. I mean, have you heard of the Inuit people living up there in the Arctic? If you think this is cold. So, but, and it made me, and I would drive around and I would say things like Pasumsik and Ompapanusik. And I'd be like, that can't be true. There had to have been a lot of people around here. That's what got me started on wanting to learn this history. And then I found out that, you're looking at the town records, places like Barnet, where I live, or Reigate, they were founded as towns by people who came from Scotland who basically bought like land without having seen it. you know, like on eBay, you know, like, oh, that looks good. Let's move there, okay. And then they get there like, what? And what are these black flies? Oh no. But but a lot of them came as Scottish bachelors, and all of a sudden you find out that they have a wife and kids, and you're like, where did the wife and kids come from? Or where did the wife come from? And a lot of times, I think a lot of these families married into Abenaki, or Abenaki women would marry a Scottish farmer, and the kids would be raised, told that they were Scottish, but they would have Abenaki ancestry. And so there's families in Barnet that people joke about as they probably are from this result, because I know a lot of people in Barnet who are from Scottish families who have skin darker than people in my black family. And I'm like, are you sure it's 100% Scottish in your ancestry? Not to go playing that game, but at the same time, it's probable that a lot of Abenaki people's descendants are alive here in Vermont, not knowing that they're from Abenaki families. Completely divorced from the culture, completely divorced from the language, just having the DNA of the first people of Vermont. That's probably the case with a lot of the old families in Vermont. That's just how that's natural. So, okay, well, we've been going for a long time, and I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions, see what they want. But to bring us finally to the modern times, I tried to go through people's lives going back to the days of the 1600s all the way to today. And most of the people that I mentioned, their lives kind of overlap. Well, Sarah Summers died in the 1920s. Actually, I have in this book, there's an article. This is kind of funny, too. It was an article from the local paper. Over a century. Last of the St. Francis tribe dead in Lunenburg home. But it says later on she's survived by all these people. So I'm like, it made it sound like she died with no children or nothing. But she had sons and daughters and grandchildren, and I'm like, so that it was at that time there was the idea of like the Indian was like something in a bottle, like a preserved, like the traditional Indian, and anything that was changed from that, you know, iconic Ansel Adams photograph of an, or was it not Ansel Adams? I'm mixing up my old photographers. Somebody help me. Curtis, yes, the Curtis photograph of the Indian, which were people from the West. You know, that was like, that's an Indian. That's a real Indian. Oh, you're not an Indian. You're wearing jeans. It's kind of like that mentality was going on in the 1920s. So that's why she was the last of the St. Francis tribe, but her kids weren't. So. So that, you know, I think of these things as very funny. Cultural identity. It's a good time to be talking about this as a country. But so now let's go to somebody whose life may have impacted yours. A guy named Homer St. Francis. Homer St. Francis was from Swanton, and he served as a Vietnam veteran. He served in many branches of the armed forces. If I ever remember correctly, he served in the Army and the Marines and in the Navy. I have actually met other Vermonters that have done that. I think it's a thing around here. So, but that enormous amount of service to the country is commendable. And then after he comes back from Vietnam, he's raising a daughter in Swanton, sending her to the elementary school. And when she's in second grade, April, his little girl comes back with her history book. It's a Vermont history textbook. And in it, the first page, it says, until the French arrived, no one but savages lived in Vermont. And Homer St. Francis just about had a fit. He just couldn't take it. He's like, after what? Oh, my people, all the stuff that we've done for this land and how much we help the English get to be Americans, and then we get called savages and get treated like this. So he decided to adopt the civil disobedience strategies that were being very well used by people like Martin Luther King at the time. And he decided to do civil disobedience, nonviolent protest. And he did things like called fish-ins. These were media events where he would make sure reporters and TV cameras would show up, and he'd have a bunch of his guys out there in boats, and they'd all be fishing without permits. Like basically calling the game warden over, come on over. And they would be like, where's your fishing permits? We don't need fishing permits. You should ask us for permission to fish here. And, oh boy, okay, we're going to have to cuff you, or we're going to have to make a big stink. And it worked. And then he did things like this. I love this one. This is one I would have loved to have participated in. He made Abenaki Nation license plates for his and his friends' cars. And I think Frederick Wiseman, who is a professor now at NVU, was Johnson State, was one of the people who got one of these. So a bunch of people put themselves on the line and put these on their cars, expecting to get pulled over, and then you get a media event, you get the publicity. And so he took the Abenaki Nation from being obscurity and something that only people knew about in their family histories to being out in the open again. And eventually, before he didn't get to see it happen in his lifetime because he died a few years before they finally got state recognition, which is now the case. Still no federal recognition for the Abenaki Nation. And I'll probably end it with this. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, as it's called, has rules for being recognized as an official tribe or nation that are based on blood quanta. And that's the kind of stuff you use for Jersey cows, not for human beings. If I told you the story of Joseph St. Louis Gill, he would have not qualified, right, with his European DNA, but the Abenaki people of the time considered him one of their own. And so it's the idea that we've been always treating these folks as if they're something different than human. And that's still the case. So when the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs got the applications from the local Abenaki nations here for permission to become federally recognized, I'll give you an example. One of the worst examples was in I think it was the Lions Club in Swanton, gave the chief of the Missisquoi people back 100 years ago a watch, a gold pocket watch engraved. And it was engraved, dedicated to the great Abenakis. Now, that word Abenakis doesn't sound like Abenaki, but it's actually closer to the correct word, Abenakik. And that means that they were trying their very best to engrave the watch accurately. They tried to make it, honorific. And when the descendant of that chief brought that to the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs saying, look, this is proof that my great-grandfather was here and he was given this by the local Lions Club, they're like, well, Abenakis, that doesn't spell Abenaki. That's not good enough. And it was like very ignorant type of, totally disconnected from real history and real culture. That was why their application got rejected at the federal level. But the state government gave recognition. And my friend Jesse, who you saw weaving baskets, he used to have a website called AbenakiBaskets.com. He's also a computer tech. That's his main job too. If you need a computer fixed near St. Johnsbury, call Jesse LaRock. But anyway, he had a website and he was selling his baskets, and then he got threatened by members, agents of the Bureau of Indian Affairs saying, you can't sell these baskets as Abenaki because you're not federally recognized. Your tribe doesn't exist, basically, in the laws of the federal government. So these are the kinds of things that have been going on in modern times. It's a really ugly continuation of that same dismissive kind of discrediting history. And it happened to Sarah Summers when they called her River Rat and Gypsy, and I think it happens to Jesse LaRock when he gets told he's not an Abenaki because they're not federally recognized. I think of it as just a technical version of the same thing. So that's what it's like right now for the Abenaki people today, I would say. Being at the same time knowing about their heritage and their culture and facing this constant headwind of people who are telling them that they're not really there or they're not really Indians or their people have been extinguished by history, like a judge in Vermont said a few years ago when they first tried to get, your people have been extinguished by the weight of history, was his words. Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of attitude. You would never use that, to talk to anybody you loved. So if you love people, you wouldn't talk to them that way. And I want to mention something totally unrelated to the Abenaki people. And this is just to add to the story. See this man? Does anybody recognize this man? He is an ambassador of the United States, and unfortunately, his death was used as a political football because he was killed in Benghazi. This is Ambassador Christopher Stevens. Okay, I'm not going to go into the ugly politics of how his death was used to try to, take other people down. But here's the fact. He is, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a full-blooded Chinook Indian from the West Coast. But if you met this man on the street, you would never think, oh, you're a full-blooded Chinook Indian, right? And that just goes to show you how even our perception of what an American Indian person is supposed to look like has been skewed by history and Hollywood and movies and all that. But I always remember that when it didn't get mentioned much in all the talk, was that this was a full-blooded Chinook man who died, serving our country far away in Libya. But that is a modern-day American Indian. That is a person of full-blooded heritage. So you can imagine how hard it is for Abenaki folks. Just to give you a little story, looking at his complexion, there was a woman who died a few years ago. She was a very nice lady. Her name is Nancy Lyons, and she was from the New Hampshire Abenaki families. And when her grandfather, her grandfather had a wife that died prematurely, so he went and married a woman that was from Oklahoma. a Muskogee woman. And Muskogee people from out in the plains, they're not the Cherokee that were forced to move to Oklahoma. They're from the native people who always lived in Oklahoma. They have some of the darkest skin of all the native peoples in this land. So when she got to New Hampshire, she discovered that everybody thought she was black. And she decided that it would be better that they thought she was black than that if they thought she was an Indian, because she would get slightly better treatment. Slightly. So when she died and her husband died, because her husband was light-skinned Abenaki and she was black-skinned Muskogee, they could not be buried in the same cemetery. Because everybody's like, well, she was a black lady, right? And they're like, actually, she wasn't, but it was too late. The story had already been baked in. So when Nancy Lyons went to help the Abenaki in New Hampshire get federal recognition, she went and dug up all her birth certificates and death certificates and all the things that she had from her family to pull this up. And she looked at it and she saw that the death certificate for her grandfather had listed his first wife as his mother, and his second wife, the Muskogee woman, was listed as his only wife. And then when, that was the stuff that the federal government used to reject these applications, being like, this paperwork is incomplete. And she's like, because the people who filled out the paperwork didn't care about my family. They didn't think it was important to be accurate. We were just rejects that lived on the edge of town, so the town clerk probably didn't even take the time to make sure things were correct on these certificates. So it's just, that's the kind of history that people from the Abenaki families felt and dealt with. And I've heard stories like this many times. So I'm going to stop there, I think, because I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions. So let me know. Please raise your hands. And I want to thank you, George, for contributing to this, because I'm glad that you were here to add in all the linguistics and the other details that I haven't learned yet.
Can you tell us about the gourds?
Oh, well, gourds, these I grew in my garden, just so you know. You can grow this in Vermont. And this is the kind of thing that was the most everyday object in an Abenaki household, used for bowls and cups and utensils, but also sometimes sacred things would be protected with gourds. And actually, something that happened at the museum, I can't explain the ritual behind it, but there is a skull that's in the museum's collection, a human skull, that we realized is from probably a native person. And so a gentleman named John Moody came and blessed it and put it inside of a gourd as a sort of a way to undo the disrespect that had been done to it in the past. I can't explain the ritual, but I do know that there is a sacred use for gourds in addition to the utilitarian stuff, not just maracas, but for storing food. And yeah, in fact, if you're interested in the material stuff, according to the story I've heard, Sarah Summers used to be able to weave sweetgrass into a kind of weave so tight that it could hold water. So imagine making a bucket out of grass. And that's the kinds of skills that have been somewhat lost in this region, of course. But any other questions? I mean, I have books over here that are some of my sources, and I can talk about anything else that you want, but let me see if there's anybody. Yes, back here.
Yeah, I was wondering, the wigwams made from birch bark, were the trees bigger at the time, like around?
Birch trees never live long. They're the kind of tree that grows back after a fire or after land's been cleared, and they generally only live about 80 years. So that's one tree that probably didn't really look any different back then than they do today, because they're short-lived trees. So I mean, there are some big birches, but you could make it at a segment, so you didn't have to have one continuous piece. You could have lots of rectangular pieces and you sew them together. So you didn't have to have a huge tree. But speaking of trees, one thing that I do want to mention, you probably have heard about all the trees that we've lost. Many of you may remember seeing giant towering elm trees and maybe even chestnut trees, the blights and the Dutch elm disease that have wiped these out. Well, during the time when the Europeans first came to this land, 1 out of every 4 trees from here all the way down south to Georgia was the American chestnut tree. That's a distribution that's impossible to have unless you have people constantly influencing the growth of the forest. So basically, if you saw a chestnut tree, you would leave it alone. You might cut the other trees around it to encourage the growth of the chestnut tree, or you might plant chestnut trees near villages, because one tree of a chestnut could produce enough food to feed a family for a month at harvest time. If you collected all the nuts, you could eat the nuts, roast them, or people used to make nut milk out of them, which is very popular nowadays, like almond milk and all that. So people used to traditionally boil the chestnuts and make this really high protein, high fat, nourishing liquid that you could drink at all times. So because the nuts were easy to store, it was like the perfect food, and it's a shame that we've lost that source of food. The salmon runs used to be so much in the rivers here that according to legend, you could walk across the rivers when the salmon were in them. You know, so we have a lot of lost resources that were well maintained by the native people. And just to add to this, according to the traditions of all the folks in the eastern woodlands, down south, up here, they would let their kids set forest fires on purpose, frequently. There would be certain areas of the woods that would be designated as a burning area, and little kids, probably, you know, my son's age, like 12 to 15, you know, would go out there with pyrite rocks and be like, and they would, yeah, and they would light it on fire, and it would be intentionally done year after year, because there would be certain tracks where all the undergrowth would be burned out. There would be no leaf litter, no twigs to snap on, and when you do all that burning, you encourage the growth of berry bushes and other, like the hazelnuts that we have wild that grow around here. So you end up basically creating a forest that's really good at feeding animals, which means that you have a forest that's really good at feeding people. And so basically creating, it's not like the idea that they left the land alone and didn't touch it. It's more like they made the entire landscape of New England a giant farm to feed lots of people. And it was like a big common farm. This is down in Virginia, but John Smith, the famous captain who, you know, I'm not going to say what he did with Pocahontas, but I'm sure it wasn't as cute as a Disney movie. But his writing, when he got off of his ship in Virginia the first time, he said he galloped his horse for more than a mile right through the trees and not a single branch touched him. That's not natural either. That's a very highly manicured landscape. And that's what I want you to imagine was going on here. It wasn't like a wilderness. In fact, the wilderness didn't happen until the 90% population crash. Then all the farm fields and all the forests got reverted to wild status. And then when European settlers came, they thought that this was a wilderness. But what it was, in the words of one author, it was a widowed land. It was a land that had been widowed of its partner, the people who had made it the way it was. So that's the way this land was when Europeans came here. So any other questions? Yes?
Question about pronunciation. I've heard Abenaki pronounced Abenaki and Abenaki. What's correct?
I might defer to George on this one, but this is what I've discovered. Most in the folks who spent time in Quebec say Abenaki. They put the emphasis with they even write it with an accent on the E, so that puts that Abenaki. But then the folks that grew up in the English-speaking part of New England say Abenaki. So I think it's more of an influence of the later languages than it is from the original. The original pronunciation, my understanding, and George, correct me if I'm wrong, is Wobanakik. Oh, that's modern too? Okay.
W, I'm going to explain about non-labial correctly. It means minimal movement of the lips. And that's the way that people used to speak then, because there was none of that, the noise you have today. It was a very quiet world, so they didn't have to speak them. So there's no F, no Q, no R, no V, and no X in the language, because they would require, you say an F, you stick out your upper lip and pull in the lower, like F, to say it. And they weren't used to doing that, so they didn't do it. And same with the R, like R, that pulls over like that. So they didn't have the R. And I don't think they had much of a W either. There is in the Abenaki alphabet, but I think when you say a W, you say would, William, you pucker out your lips every time you say it. So I think they would have used that only when they had to shout or speak loudly or emphasis. So they would have used like Abenaki. Sebastian Rao, a Jesuit missionary in Maine, he was later killed and scalped by Moulton's Rangers. He said they have several letters in their, the way they talk, of no motion of the lips at all. He said, OU is one of that number. So that shows how quietly they normally spoke. So I think that W is also a modern way of doing it. I got it in there because I wrote that drew those pictures, did a lettering back in 1987. I didn't quite know that yet, but I found out later on. Now I spell it Abenaki, O, the circumflex O, that's a O with a little tent on it, it's called like O, not O, ooh, like that. And then apostrophe, and B-A-N-A-K-I-A-K. Because you gotta put the animate plural at the end.
They keep
Abenaki.
Yeah. Well, see, I remember meeting you a long time ago, George, and I wished I had more time to sit there and learn every lesson I could from you. But I remember that there was, didn't you tell me once that the word for yes?
That's what people say,
And this is not the first. It's not the first time I heard that. That's where that might have entered the English language. It was from Native people. The word toboggan, wigwam, maple syrup production in general is all from Abenaki tradition. So the idea, there's a lot of folk etymologies, but this one is convincing to me because that funny nasal sound was so unusual that even the French had to write a special letter for it in the language the Jesuits made. And you think French would have no problem saying yeah, right? But when they encountered the Abenaki and they tried to create an alphabet to describe the Abenaki language, they assigned the number 8 to that sound because they couldn't make it with the normal letters. So if you look at Abenaki written with the Roman alphabet, it has the number 8 as a letter, frequently used, and it looks really weird, like high tech.
Replaced with a circumflex O. They didn't have in the ancient French, old French printing presses had to be done by hand. They didn't have the circumflex O yet, so they used an 8. And by 1884, though, they did have it, and now you get a copy of, and you can get a copy today too, of Chief Joseph Lawrence, Abenakis and English Dialogues. It has a circumflex O in it. That's a lot easier to understand.
Yeah.
Then you come to Henry Warren Massa's Abenaki Legends Grammar Place, printed also at Odenak in 1932. That's got 8s in it. It's like he's going back. Why didn't they have to circumflex something? That's a lot easier. Well, they say tradition.
Well, yeah, so it stayed in the Abenaki and it moved on in French. They stopped using it.
So I just noticed you put the Quebec Museum back up.
Yeah.
Are Abenaki federally recognized in Canada?
Yes, as a First Nation, yeah. They don't face the same problem that they have here. They're given the full recognition and they get funding for this museum. And so it's a different story. It's treated with a lot better respect, but they have a reservation there. Odenak is their reservation.
St. Lawrence is closer. Oh, it's halfway between Quebec City and Montreal.
Yeah, and that, as far as I know, that wasn't traditionally an area that was very important to them up until the French arrived. It was basically, the French are here, let's hang out and trade here. So it's sort of, that whole town is basically an artifact of French and Abenaki, relationship, and that's where their mission was there, the church and all that. And I didn't get into it, but here's a plaque, and here's the church in Odenak, just across the courtyard from that museum. And here is a memorial to what happened on October 4th, 1759. Maybe you learned about this from that movie with Spencer Tracy, North by Northwest. But Captain Robert Rogers, well, I went to Amherst College, okay? And my college is named after the person who invented biological warfare in North America, Lord Jeffrey Amherst. The school has changed the mascot name because they don't want to be called Lord Jeffs anymore because of this. But he got the idea of taking smallpox blankets from the clinics and the hospitals and selling them to the Abenaki people and other people in New England so they could get rid of them. And yes, that was an idea of Lord Jeffrey Amherst's. And he told Captain Robert Rogers to go into Odenak. And he basically, that was behind enemy lines. Odenak was like safely inside of French territory. So he decided, let's do this psychological operation. Let's go into Odenak. Let's destroy that village. And then the Abenaki will stop helping the French because they'll be like, whoa, our home village is not even safe. We're going to stop being a part of this war. So on October 4th, 1759, before the sun rose, about 220 British soldiers and a few native guides, not from the Abenaki Nation, but from other nearby tribes, stormed into Odenak, and they set every wigwam on fire. The people who survived the wigwams burning ran to the church, figuring that these Europeans won't burn a church down, and they did. So inside the church, an untold number of people, with the priests and the nuns and brothers and deacon, anybody who was there, died in that church. But there's two versions of the story. When Robert Rogers got back to Massachusetts, only 20 of his original company of 220 survived. because he and the officers got into boats and they left. And they said, good luck getting back to Massachusetts. We'll see you when you get there. The rest of them had to walk. And they had to walk through Vermont, which at that time was all Abenaki-controlled land, and no British faces anywhere nearby. So they had to go, they left Odanak and they went down through Memphremagog into the Connecticut River Valley, and then they went down through where I live now in Barnet. And there's a legend in Barnet of Stephen's Island. It's an island that's shaped like a teardrop in the middle of the river. When the first farmers from Scotland got there, they found all these scabbards and belt buckles and knives there from British soldiers that had been turned to rust and soil from when they plowed that island. And they're like, what's all this? According to the legend, that was where one of the groups of Rogers Raiders were supposed to meet their reinforcements. There was supposed to be some British soldiers with food and boats waiting for them, but when they got there, all they found was smoldering fires and no food or anything. So that's what Robert Rogers told Amherst when he got back to Massachusetts was, yeah, we successfully raided the village, but I guess my men didn't make it, sorry. But the officers are here, so who cares, right? So that's kind of the way they were. But Robert Rogers got Nathan Hale killed, by the way, so that's another story. So seriously, Nathan Hale, he got him killed later on. He was so bad, he actually wanted to get a job with George Washington. George Washington wouldn't hire him. This is the same Robert Rogers who pulled off this raid. But anyway, I don't want to metastasize my historical knowledge all over the place. But now, when Robert Rogers pulled off this raid, according to local tradition, this is from people who are descended from the people from that village. One of the guides with Robert Rogers actually got a guilty conscience the night before. He realized that they were about to go basically and kill a bunch of women and children. And so before the night before, he walked into the village and goes, hey, I'm with a company of British soldiers that's about to raid you at sunrise. You all need to get out of here. And so that's what happened, is that everybody who could get out of there did. And the only people who were killed were the people who were too infirm to get out and leave. So it was actually not that many people murdered at the church burning, but they were all waiting in the woods for the raiders to leave. And they chased them and picked them off one by one on the way back to Massachusetts. So what happened in Barnet was probably like a British soldier got there with a boat and a fire, and there's a bunch of Abenaki warriors going, and he didn't make it. And so when the guys from Rogers Raid showed up, all they see was smoldering fires, and they're like, where's our buddy? Where'd he go? I don't know. And they all either starved or were attacked again. So that's why those belt buckles and scabbards and things were found on that island. And none of those soldiers were ever heard from again. Maybe some of them went native. And they were like, wait, you guys eat a lot better than we do back at the fort. I'm going to join you guys. Forget the salt pork and hardtack. I want to go back to moose and salmon. Yes?
I've heard a legend that there was a statue that came from that church.
The Silver Lady of Lourdes.
Silver
Yes.
Lady that was dropped somewhere around here.
Anywhere between Odanak and somewhere in middle Vermont, there could be that silver statue somewhere in the ground, somewhere at the bottom of a river. It's probably at the bottom of the body of water. But it was, the Odanak Chapel had a silver statue brought from France, the Lady of Lourdes, that was actually in the chapel, and that went missing during the raid. So the assumption is that a soldier took it and looted a bunch of other stuff, probably too. And who knows, maybe one of you folks could find it in your backyard someday. Stranger things have happened. So any other questions about any of this stuff? I could talk about this all night, I know. I love this subject. So, no? Oh, it's my pleasure.